Hi, everyone, and very welcome to this live public meeting called Rise with PBP. This meeting is a public meeting by People Before Profit. My name is Madeleine Johansson. I'm a councillor for People Before Profit in the Palmerstown, Fonthill local electoral area of South Dublin County Council. I'm chairing the meeting and hosting the meeting tonight, and I suppose we're having very great news to give out to people. I'm sure some of you have already heard and already know that Paul Murphy TD and his group RISE have now joined with People Before Profit, and Paul Murphy is now a People Before Profit TD, and this is really good news for the left, that the left is uniting at a time when we need it the most, when ordinary people are fighting hard to keep their jobs, to make ends meet, and are fighting for their jobs, for better services, etc. So before, I'm not going to go on for too long. So we have 4 speakers tonight. So the first is Gino Kenny TD for the Dublin Midwest area for People Before Profit. Then we have a guest speaker from who is a Debenhams striker from the picket lines up in Tallaght, Carol Quinn. And then we have Paul Murphy TD for Dublin Southwest speaking. And lastly, our Clondalkin representative for People Before Profit, Dara Adelaide, will be speaking at the end. So how we're going to do this is the speakers are going to talk for about 5-10 minutes each, and then we'll take a bit of discussion at the end. So leave your questions, leave your comments down below, and we'll be able to ask. If you have a particular question for a particular speaker, just say so, and I'll be reading them out and asking the questions once the speakers have finished. So first up is Gino Kenny, TD for People Before Profit.
Thanks, Madeleine, and thanks for everybody for coming tonight. It's not our usual kind of space. We have to do this for kind of temporarily. So hopefully in a couple of months' time, we'll be back to a scenario where we have packed halls. It seems like alien kind of almost, but then hopefully then days will come back, and because it's better than speaking to a laptop and so forth. I just want to just make a comment on Paul Murphy joining People for Profit and RISE. I think it's an extremely positive development, and I think it's very, very good for working people that the radical left have an extra TD and so forth, and we are coherent and a voice in the Dáil and out of the Dáil, more importantly. And I'd probably trace this back to a certain degree in the late and mid 90s when Joe Higgins got first elected. I think he got elected first in 1997, and there's always been since then. There's always been a voice of the radical left, and it's so important that there's a voice of the radical left in the Dáil, because it can, it does make a huge difference. As I said, outside Dáil, that's where it makes the difference. And in recently, hundreds of people have joined People for Profit, and I think the reason why they have joined is that they see, what we do. It makes sense. It does. We say what we do exactly on the tin, and people respect that. And we work as best as we can in the localities we're from, and that's very, very important. That we continue that work, and it's important that the radical left have a voice in the Dáil, to kind of challenge the political establishment, and that's extremely important, and to give hope, and to give kind of, I suppose, clarity on issues that matter to people the most. And just going back to, it seems like an eternity, in February 2020, when probably the most important election that has happened in, I think, a long time, where the kind of the axis of Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil was torn apart, and it was a political earthquake. And that earthquake kind of broke apart that kind of atom, that the two-party system was broken. And, you know, Sinn Féin done very, very well, you know, becoming the most popular party in the state. And that kind of, you know, really, really kind of opened things up for a different kind of, I suppose, circumstances. And that was, I would argue, is a very, very positive thing. The vast majority of people that vote for Sinn Féin are kind of working class people, and they wanted to see something very, very different from what has happened in the last 100 years. And that's really, really positive. It opens up other kind of debates that will go on in the future about left government and so forth. Just going back to the election was, you know, it was a 3-week campaign to a certain degree. It was fought over not kind of the Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil policy to a certain degree it was, but it was largely to do with public services and the lack of public services in relation to schools, our health and education system. And people were kind of extremely kind of frustrated in relation to them services that they were not getting. And also they were fed up of the Punch and Judy show of Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil. So it kind of, you know, it opened up a lot of things for something quite different in the future. And, you know, one thing that, you know, socialists have always, you know, said about this state is that, you know, there was never a clear left right divide, because Fine Gael or Fianna Fáil was in, you know, like a government in composition, and then you had the Labour Party. So you had a 2.5 party system where the Labour Party were kind of the mudguard of these two kind of right-wing parties. So and the Labour Party, you know, you've seen what their kind of situation is. They will never kind of claw back that respect that they had in working class areas. That's been replaced by whole different forces. So so that kind of dynamic is going on about, you know, where there's a clear left of and right divide. The right is Fine Gael, Fianna Fáil, with some independence. I mean, they're kind of generic Fine Gael, Fianna Fáil anyway, and so they're just kind of mercenaries, really, political mercenaries. Unfortunately, the Green Parties has gone into a coalition with Fine Gael, Fianna Fáil, and you know they'll pay the price to a certain degree. So there's a clear left right divide in the Dáil, which is a very, very good thing, because in them circumstances, then you can you know, you can clearly kind of make a distinction to a certain degree. There is, you know, will there be a call for, you know, the left coming together, like with Sinn Féin leading the government? It's a debate that we'll have in the future. It's good that we're talking about a left government, but it can't be just a left government just in kind of name. It has to be about, you know, policy. It has to be about kind of, you know, where working people are kind of at the helm rather than being at the back. And, you know, for too long, the kind of the people that have ran the state have been in the interests of, you know, it's, you know, the elite and the golden circle and kind of vested interest of capitalism. And Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil will say, well, it's not, that's not the case, you know, that's all in your mind. But it's, you know, that's just throwing dust in your face. That's all, it's all the reality of why we have a system that has kind of, you know, created these two parties that have been in kind of power for over 100 years. And I think just on the pandemic, I think the pandemic has shown us as socialists that, you know, where the people that run, you know, society are workers, ordinary workers that have kind of kept the show on the road. Like, think about it. They brought us, you know, bus drivers have brought us to work. Frontline staff have taken care of us. All the workers that have been in supermarkets, all them kind of jobs that were, I hate using that word, kind of menial jobs, you know, kind of low pay jobs, you know, these jobs are extremely important, and they keep kind of society kind of afloat, and that kind of social fabric. And us as working people, that has kind of, you know, pulled together in a time of national crisis, where kind of, you know, with the vast kind of obscene amount of wealth that these people make during the pandemic. It's obscene, absolutely obscene. So I think that's, you know, has, the fault lines have been shown, and it's up to us to kind of, after this pandemic is finished, is to kind of, you know, kind of, I suppose, critique that, and kind of give people confidence, and you know, where we need to go next. Just in relation to kind of the last 2 points I want to make, in relation to, you know, it's good that we have a growing organization, rural, urban, you know, and I think people really respect the party, and it's growing quite quickly, and hopefully a lot of people will, you know, join, and kind of will kind of go into its ranks, and we'll have different branches across the country. Just 2 points of notes. There is a few clouds, dark clouds, that kind of have are on the horizon, and one of them is in relation to, you know, the far right. Now, the far right in this country, luckily, have no kind of electoral kind of, you know, they don't have any councillors or any TDs, which is good. So they're a kind of a very fragmented, kind of a disparate grouping. But in the last general election, they stood up a lot of candidates, and they are more confident than ever. Just looking, you know, they look at different other countries where the far right have done well. So it's really, really important that the united front of the left, to Nicola, to kind of groups like, you know, United Against Racism, that the left, you know, people that are progressive and, you know, are against racism, that they come together, because that's so important. That the far right should never ever get any sort of foothold in this country. Not only in, you know, in kind of spaces of councils or the Dáil, but in our communities, and that's so important. Just on the last, I don't know if I've gone there. Honestly, hopefully you can still hear me. Just in relation to the issue of the party, hopefully, you know, a lot of people that will join in the coming months, and, you know, we need to build a force of, you know, that's a party that represents working people. Because when I joined a long time ago, I was always looking for a party that represented the working class people, and weren't going to sell them out, and weren't like you have a situation where you elect a TD or a council, and you never see them again, and you know they do all these dull weird deals, you know, Gobinism that goes on. We are not that party. We are a party that will, you know, fundamentally will represent workers. We take we take a wage that's an ordinary industrial wage, so we don't have this inflated kind of wages that other TDs get, and so forth. So look at, I think it's exciting what's happening in relation to the party, but we need to build on that kind of, you know, that kind of good kind of vibe that's going around, not only inside the Dáil but outside the Dáil, which is extremely important, because people power, when we get together, is the driving force, is the cutting edge of working class politics. There's nothing else. You know, we can be in the Dáil, you know, and it's important that we're in there, but the cutting edge of radical change is people power. And, you know, we do things on a local basis and a national basis, but we're also internationalists, and we're internationalists on the basis that, you know, that we look towards, you know, other movements and other kind of, I suppose, you know, workers, where they have will challenge the kind of hegemony of where they are in that state. So this is extremely important. We're internationalists at the heart, and, you know, we are for kind of challenging the political establishment. So with that, I think it's really, really important that anybody that is tuning in tonight, that joins the party in the next, as soon as possible. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Gino. And I suppose considering what Gino has said about obviously the importance of having elected representatives for the left, but that a lot of what we do is not inside the Dáil or on councils, but outside of that. And therefore, I'm delighted to introduce our next speaker, who is Carol Quinn, who is a striking Debenhams workers. They've been on strike for almost a year at this stage, manning the picket lines after the disgraceful um, redundancy, I suppose, a non-redundancy offered by Debenhams Ireland almost a year ago now. So I'm going to give it up to Carol, and I'm really privileged to have you here speaking with us tonight. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Madeleine. First of all, I have to say, please excuse me for having my little notebook here, because I wouldn't be like Gino. I'm not used to standing up and giving speeches, etc. But throw me into the boxing ring with people that are being unfairly treated in work, and I give it my all. But I just wanted to break this down into 3 little sections, and the first one is just to tell you a little bit about myself and how I became a shop steward and that, because I was always a very, very quiet person. And my name is Carol, as Madeleine said, and I have worked for 30 years in Roche's stores and Debenhams. I had a part-time job for 20 hours, and I reared 3 children through that. So I always felt I gave it my all over the 30 years. You put yourself out, your kids are sick, you still make it to work. So I'm a working class person. In 1990, the square opened, and it was a huge thing for Tallaght, because so many houses were put up there. There was no amenities and nothing around us. That when the square opened, it was fantastic for people to get their shopping. They could get out for a morning, and for me, it was to get back to the working place. For 12 years, I worked in Roche's in Henry Street, and took 4 years off, and then I went back to the square to work, which is great. In 2006, Debenhams took over Roche's, and by 2010, there was a huge amount of redundancies. They really cut everything back to the bone so that they could make profit. That was just their thing. And if you took the redundancy then, which I had the choice then, you got 5 plus 2, which was a great package for those people that went. So after those redundancy, there was an opportunity, because the shop steward went for somebody to step up and be a shop steward, and absolutely nobody ever wants that job. But as I said, I was a very, very quiet person, went in and out of work and just listened all the time, and never really got too involved. But I had a 2-year case I took against Debenhams for equality, a comment that a manager made, and it took a lot out of me after 2 years. I never slept, but she actually made a quote to say that she would have preferred a younger person for the job. So over the 2 years, I grew really, really, really strong as a person, and it never got to court. It did get a date for the Equality Court, but it was statute barred. And for those who don't know what that means, it means that Mandate never received a letter from the Equality case, from the Equality Court. They said there was a new girl on the reception, so the letter was never traced. So I missed the date, and I never got my day in court. But out of that, I think I became a strong person. And I believe that I, from then, decided that I would stand up for workers who couldn't really talk or couldn't really fight their cases. And that's what I've done over the last 12 years. So I'll take you up now to the virus came last year, and it was getting really bad in March, and I was on a week's holidays. And by the end of March, they were shutting down the shop. So the girls had to kind of pack up all the stock and put everything in cages and put everything away, which didn't sound really right for a shop that was only going to close for a little while. So then on April the 7th, I got a generic email without even my name on it after 30 years. And I read it again. I had to hand it to my son to read it. And it was that my job was gone. I actually couldn't believe it. Now I was stomached. But within that hour, there was hundreds of phone calls, hundreds of texts from all the staff. And I can honestly say, between that day and Christmas, my phone hasn't stopped. The worry of it, the stress of it, the money end of it, the redundancy, the terms and conditions, everything that you could possibly worry about, the girls have asked me to help them with. And I honestly say that I've enjoyed helping them. Through the first few weeks, we protested. We went on official strike, so we got out of the Bank of Ireland. You might stand outside the square, which they'd always hoosh us away. But eventually then Mandy asked us to vote on strike, and we did. It was unanimous that we all went on strike. So then officially then we had our pickets, and we were at the back of the bay, stopping the trucks coming in, because we felt, the 11 stores felt, that the stock was our only hold over KPMG. It was that if we could get some redundancy out of that stock, because now that we're gone into liquidation, they were saying there was no money for the staff at all. And I suppose that's probably why I've kept strong and kept fighting, because at the end of the day, once again, the worker is at the bottom of the pile, which is just so unfair. And I feel what's kept me going through these months is that my children and my grandchildren will not have to be put in the situation that I've been put in. You know, after 30 years of dedication, and the other girls are 20, 15, doesn't matter how long they're there, they gave their all, and now they're a nobody, and there's nothing at the end of all their years. There's no money, no payments, no nothing. So we picketed from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m, which was tough. I was on the road at 5 a.m. myself. That was my shift. It was tough. And after 6 then we used to do a car run. And then through the night, I have to say, hand on heart, we had fantastic support from People Before Profit, from RISE, and from Solidarity. And only for them, we probably wouldn't have been able to do as much as we could do. And all the people, all the staff in Tallaght, I've always thanked everybody for that support. So some days we kind of did as much as we could, but we heard afterwards that the stock was taken out in the middle of the night on a Sunday. So that was very disappointing, and a lot of people were very upset about that. But we still continued to picket there. Like through those months, I've been in and spoke to Leo Varadkar, and he boldly sat there and said, you know, I can't see anything wrong with just getting a certain percentage out of stock. And then when you walk away from that, he says the opposite in the media, and he's totally against the workers. So that was very disappointing for me, because I really felt we were led up the garden path with them, that they did say they were going to support us. And same with Micheál Martin, it was like down in Cork, you know, we were treated so shabbily, and etc. etc. We really felt that, you know, we were going to have them on our side, but in the end we didn't actually. Also, we're fighting for that the law be changed, that in the future if this happens, that the worker won't be at the end of the pile, that the worker will be way up there with the creditors, you know. So we're still on strike, we still pick up every day. Obviously we're not protecting stock. We have a huge issue at the moment, which is going to be kind of going out in a campaign on the media regarding our lockers. Today they kind of more or less said that our property will be put in a black bag, and just your number of your locker will be put there and be more or less handed to you at the door. So we're very upset about that today as well, because a lot of people have a lot of private stuff and they want their private files. So that's a battle that we have today that we have to try and work on. We as I said, we've met with so many TDs, and what it has boiled down to now is that they have offered 3 million for training. Now, most of the people that are on strike are getting training anyway, and when you go to Solis, you're entitled to training. So we're trying to turn that 3 million into cash. The latest I hear from Andy today is that they've written to Solis to try and sit down with us and see if we can work out something that would be creative. That I don't know whether we'll ever get that 3 million in cash, but that's where we're at the moment. And you know, through COVID, it's been really, really tough, fighting for justice and striking, because you know you're going out and meeting people which you don't really want to be going out, standing there. You're in all sorts of ways. It's been a really, really tough battle. I remember particularly one day standing in the lashings of the rain. It was 6 a.m. and because we stepped over just this line that the square has that is at the bay, the security men came down and said, and we stood there because there was a wall where we're normally behind a gate, you know, that if we didn't get back off the line, we're going to get the guards. And they did call the guards on us, you know, so things like that. It's been a really big struggle, and especially through COVID. We never really got, I feel, a chance. We did a few protests in town outside the Dáil, etc. But we never really got the full, we couldn't through COVID, you know. But the fight still continues, and we'll still continue to have the law changed. That's no doubt about that, and I'm very proud of that. But I do have to say, without the support of People Before Profit, Solidarity and RISE, we wouldn't be able to do what we've done in that year. So I'm really, really proud that all the people I've met through that, and I could name them individually, but not in case I leave somebody out, but they've been really great support to us. So lastly, I'd like to talk a little bit about Paul Murphy. Now, I met Paul Murphy through the water charges, and I'm not a political type person, but the water charges really annoyed me because my daughter had just bought a house and she had a little child, and I thought she really can't afford to be paying any more money. And I heard of these meetings that were going on that Paul Murphy had organised. So I gathered up a few of my sisters in Tallaght and a few friends, and we went to all the marches and protests that we could possibly go to. And I feel about Paul Murphy, I'm delighted that he's joining People Before Profit. And I feel about Paul Murphy, he's an action man, and don't take that like literally he's the toy of the action man. He is an action man. He walks the talk. He says and does what the establishment doesn't want to hear. And I can't thank Paul enough for all the help that he has given us through. I only have to send a text. The same with Gino. The same with Eddie. I only have to text and the support is there. But I do believe through the water charge, when I met Paul, I was so in awe of that this person could speak so well, so loud, and so down to earth to us Tallaght people. And I want to wish him all the best of luck. Please forgive me, I'm a little bit nervous, but I was a bit anxious when Eddie asked me to get on, but I said because it was Paul Murphy, I will give him my all. So thank you very much. And if I've left out anything, please feel free to ask me any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carol, and we're so happy to have you here. I mean, you and the other workers at Debenhams are such an inspiration to working class people in this country and beyond for what you're doing, and to still be fighting is really, really, really commendable. And there's been a lot of messages coming in saying thank you for speaking, and a lot of solidarity. From, for example, for solidarity from G&B in Hull, over in Britain. So there's a lot of support coming your way to the Debenhams workers. So thank you for speaking to us. So next speaker doesn't need much of an introduction. He's TD for the Tallaght area, and Carol has already talked a little bit about him. And Paul Murphy has been representing the people in Tallaght since 2014, I believe, if I'm not wrong, since the by-election when he was elected to the Dáil. So huge welcome to Paul Murphy, TD.
Thanks a lot, Madeline, and thanks a million, Carol, for your very, very kind words. And yeah, I'd really echo the sentiment of Eddie in the Facebook chat, saying what an inspiration Carol and all of the Debenhams workers have been. I mean, you know, for those of us who have been, you know, struggling for fundamental socialist change for whatever amount of time, it is what keeps you going. Is, you know, people like Carol, just the capacity of ordinary people to sacrifice and struggle against everything that's been thrown against them, and it's what gives you confidence that actually ordinary people are going to change the world, despite everything that's arrayed against them. And thanks a million everyone in People Before Profit for the very warm welcome for me and the other members of RISE. I guess what I'm going to talk about is a couple of important kind of points of agreement between that are the basis upon which RISE decided to join People Before Profit, and that I'd encourage anybody who's watching and who isn't a member to join People Before Profit. And I think that takes place in the context of, like, we are in a race against time. I think in a couple of different ways. One, Gino referenced the danger of the rise of the far right. We've been, you know, fortunate in this country that in the last decades we haven't had a very active or visible or strong far right movement. But there's no question that these people who want to have a society that is a dictatorship, that is dominated by the Catholic Church, that has horrendous oppression of women, of LGBTQ people, of ethnic minorities, of travelers, of many others, that these people are very consciously seeking to exploit the real frustrations of people around lockdown, to try and build themselves and to become a relevant political force. And given the kind of direction of society and the likely continued decline of the so-called centre, in reality the right wing of Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael and so on in politics, that they are going to have opportunities, just like there'll be opportunities for the left, and we're in a race against time to ensure that we are the credible alternative to the establishment, and that we're able to take people's real anger and correct frustration and point it at those responsible, the government and the capitalist system, and the likes of your Dennis O'Briens and your Larry Goodmans and so on, who are to blame, as opposed to them kind of kicking downwards, which is what they do. And the other race against time that we're in is the race against catastrophic climate change. Rosa Luxemburg famously kind of coined the phrase, which she took it from Engels, I think, but socialism or barbarism. And in today's term, that's eco-socialism or barbarism. We are, with our eyes wide open in terms of the scientific information that we have, tobogganing towards absolute catastrophe, towards like passing many tipping points and feedback loops and so on, and left in the hands of the kind of left society, left on the organized basis that it is now, there's no indications that we're going to turn back from that, and we are running out of time. And they are contexts which should make everybody, organizations and individuals, think really seriously about what we're doing. And I think for RISE, it certainly meant that if we can come together with people for profit to build a common, broad, eco-socialist party with a serious chance of becoming, a mass force in this country, well, then we should. That we have a responsibility to, like, humanity, to be honest, but above all, kind of working class people in this country, to try and come together if we can. And that does involve like building an organization which is going to be a space, and is a space already, all the meetings we go to are a real space of debate, of difference, of disagreements sometimes, and then a democratic decision-making process, because that's a part of how we're going to redevelop the workers' movement and the left, is like training people to have debates and discussions in a certain kind of fraternal, friendly way. And secondly, and most importantly, it's about building a real vehicle for people power, for working class organization, and to give people an alternative. And I suppose one of the like kind of points of agreement, which are very important, is centering the concept of eco-socialism. So what does eco-socialism mean? I think it's kind of well summed up in a way by this guy, Chico Mendes, who's a Brazilian environmentalist, but also trade unionist. He said, environmentalism without class struggle is just gardening. And that's, you know what I mean? You see the Green Party in government, that is very, very clearly demonstrated. But the reverse is also true in a sense. That class struggle without environmentalism is a dead end, because it means ignoring the central crisis which poses an existential threat to humanity, certainly the type of life that we are used to today. And that's from both climate catastrophe and from the biodiversity crisis. And in essence, what we mean by eco-socialism is understanding that the crises that we face are the consequence not just of human action, but of human action in a human society organized on a certain basis, which is on the basis of capitalism and like the organization of society for maximization of profit. This, organization of society, this economy exploits nature as well as labor and treats it as something of no value. That's kind of rooted in the way capitalism is organized. Your boss, decides to produce whatever, and he looks at the various inputs. He says, he or she says, we're going to pay this much for wages, this much for land, this much for capital. And at the end of it, we can sell it for this, and will we make a profit or not? And what they don't look at is what's going to be the consequences in terms of our environment, and that consequence on human health, on alienation, on everything else into the future. So the kind of, and you can look at lots of figures for this and so on. You can look at the responsibility of 100 corporations for 71% of our carbon emissions. The kind of crisis that we're facing is rooted in the organization of society on the basis of capitalism. That means that stopping climate change is only possible by building a mass movement, and in particular based on the power of working class people who produce all this wealth to defeat these very, very powerful interests that we're up against. At the core of capitalism is fossil fuel capitalism, and in order for us not to destroy our planet, basically tens of trillions of dollars of fossil fuels that are on their balance sheet have to become worthless. They have to stay in the ground, and they're going to fight absolutely tooth and nail for their right to profit, for their right to dig up those fossil fuels, and for the right for those fossil fuels to be burned, regardless of the consequence. So we need a massive movement from below to do that. And in trying to build that mass movement, that has to be a movement to stop climate change, but it also has to offer people a future that is radically transformed in the interest of ordinary people. So the struggle against climate change is also a struggle to improve people's lives, to have a 4-day week without loss of pay, and to have free, green, and frequent public transport, but also to have control over our economy and our society, so that we can have ownership of the key sections of the economy, democratically planned, so we can plan for a rapid and just transition. That's the kind of essence of eco-socialism and what we're going to try to popularize. The second point, and I'll finish on this, and it kind of flows from what Gino was saying about kind of what's happening in Irish society, is something major is happening in terms of a shift away from the establishment political parties who, formerly would have had 80% of the vote, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael. They're down in the last election to about 45%. They're down in opinion polls since then. There's a big change taking place, for which Sinn Féin is the major recipient at this point in time, because they're the biggest, loudest voice with the most resources, the biggest voice in the Dáil, and so on. But very significant, 31% of people who voted in the last election said in an exit poll they want radical change. And we think that the socialist or eco-socialist left has to very positively engage with that sentiment, and we have to become the champions of the idea of a left government based on people power and committed to the kind of eco-socialist policies that are necessary to deliver the change that we need, and the reasons that people are looking towards Sinn Féin and the rest of the and parties on the left. And a part of that, in being the champions of that, is to champion the idea that those parties who are the recipients of support for change should rule out coalition with Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael. And those parties who refuse to rule out coalition with Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael are going to rightly raise questions for people about their seriousness about the kind of change that we need and the kind of government that we need. Because we have learned, or we certainly should have learned the lesson over and over again from the Greens this time, from Labour before, from the Greens before, from Labour before, and many times before, that Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael represent the interests of the big corporations, the bankers, the bondholders, the big landlords, big developers in this country, big agribusiness, and they are not going to allow the kind of policies that we need, that people need, to resolve all the crises in people's lives, because they interfere with the profits of those people. So a government that includes those parties will not be the kind of government that we need. So we need to absolutely rule out coalition with those people, and we need to put pressure on Sinn Féin and others to say you should also rule out coalition with Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael. And the other and last point I'll make is that it also should learn the lessons from history, for example, from the Syriza government in 2015, I think, and not repeat the betrayals and defeats. And centrally, that is that if we're to have a left government that isn't going to let people down, it must realize that, in a sense, the election of a government is only a step in opening a process. It's very, very far from the end of the process, because those people who currently rule our society, even if you had a left government, they would still own and control the core sectors of the economy. They still have massive power, and they still have, in reality, control over the levers of the state. And so we need to have a left government that bases itself on people power and is serious about implementing eco-socialist policies to actually take on the likes of Larry Goodman, Dennis O'Brien, the likes of the REITs in this country, who are control increasing amounts of the housing supply. That if, for example, we're going to build a national health service, well, then we need to be able to say, well, no to the Bon Secours, no to Larry Goodman, is that those things should be taken, those private health industries should be taken into public homes, public control, and used to build a national health service that is a quality one-tier national health service. To say that if we are going to reduce carbon emissions by 10% a year, which we absolutely need to do to make a serious contribution to avoiding climate catastrophe, well, then we need to have ownership and control of the big polluting sectors of the economy. So your Ryanair, but again, also your big agribusiness, in order to be able to transform the nature of travel, transform the nature of agriculture in this country. Or, for example, in relation to the housing crisis, we have to say that the big landlords, the big developers, should actually be in public ownership and be used in the interests of society. Similarly with the banks, I mean, you see the scandal in terms of Davies. The idea that, like, effectively society is run for the banks, as opposed to the banks and the financial system being used as a public utility for and run in the interests of society, is doesn't make any sense. So I just finished by saying, obviously, look, that's a very big task. We don't underestimate the scale of the task. But looking at struggles like the water charges, like repeal, like Debenhams, we should have confidence in the power of ordinary people to really fight and really bring about substantial change. And what we need to do is to get organized in a major political organization like People for Profit, based on people power, based on activists. So I just would appeal to others who are looking on at this and say, now's the time to get involved, to join the Dublin Midwest branch if you're in that area, or whatever branch, wherever you are living. So thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Paul. Thanks for speaking to us tonight, and it's great, obviously, to have you on board with People Before Profit. And I suppose I said earlier that we're not just about TDs and councillors, so I think it's important to to hear from one of our I suppose, newer members, younger members, someone who has got involved in the last couple of years, and is part of the big shift that's happening at the moment, where people are starting to see beyond the establishment politics of Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, and moving to the left and looking to the left and joining, most importantly, joining left-wing parties like People Before Profit. So our next speaker is Dara Adelaide. He is an activist from Clondalkin. He's also a Gaeilgeoir, and I'm not going to try to introduce him in Irish, because unfortunately I can't. I'm not able to do that. But yeah, he's a great activist from the new Clondalkin representative of People Before Profit, a local area rep. Dara.
Hi everyone. I'll start off first by saying, or I guess welcoming Paul and other members of RISE. I've talked to quite a few of you on the Debenhams picket and as well online, and you seem like a really great bunch of activists, so I'm looking forward to working together. As the others have said, I think it's a really great opportunity that we have now to have a unified voice on the left to fight for regular people. With the last election, there's been a massive shift away from the civil war parties. People are looking for change, and I think People Before Profit, it needs to play a key role in fighting for that change and building a mass movement against the political establishment. And I think one example that I have of us working together to bring about that change, and like as a young person, as a student, I look at the motion that People Before Profit had recently before the Dáil regarding students. It really isn't a great time to be a student right now. It's difficult to find support. It's hard being isolated. It's extremely expensive. And it's particularly hard on students who may be from rural backgrounds who don't have great access to the internet. So we've seen those inequalities that existed beforehand. They're being amplified by this pandemic. And people from disadvantaged backgrounds who really need that kind of support, they're missing out. Families who have lost incomes because of the pandemic are struggling to put their kids through college, which is, in Ireland, it's one of the most expensive systems in Europe. And students were told to take out to rent and to pay deposits on accommodation that they're no longer using. So I think the motion that we put forward, it really shows what you can do when you have a unified voice. It calls for an end to college fees, which are brought back. They were brought back by Labour and Fine Gael after they cut funding towards third level education. I guess it's the same story throughout this pandemic. The cuts that were made years ago, they're coming back to bite us now. And Susie is great, but a lot of students, they fall through the gaps. One of the other things is an end to unpaid work placements. The student nurses have really shown they're a perfect example of how unjustified it is. You have students who are taking a lot of the pressure that's been placed on our underfunded health system, and they also have to work part-time jobs as well as that, just so they can afford their rent. No student should have to, work without pay. I think it locks working class students out of education. If you work a full-time job to support yourself through college or to support your family, how do you have the time then to do a full-time unpaid internship as well? The other thing that was brought up in the motion, I think, is very important. Full rights for students who are renting. It's something that's sorely needed. Out in DCU, where I go to college, after the 4% limit on rent rises that the government brought in, the Shannon accommodation, they put up their prices by 20% because there's loopholes that are there specifically to allow students to be exploited. I think it's massively important that together, Paul, Breed, Gino, Richard, and all the other members of PBP, that we've been able to stand up and say, this isn't right. We have a lot of students joining recently. I think it's something that's extremely important because it's something we need to fight on. And because we have that unified voice, we're able to counter the rhetoric, the establishment, and of the establishment, and we're able to, start that groundwork or on the ground activism that we need. And one thing that really struck me as a young person, I guess, is the lack of support and the funding for people who are having trouble with their mental health. Again, a lot of cuts that were made back during the bank bailout. I was a child at the time, but we're all still paying the price for that now. Personally, I've been in this situation before, waiting on a never-ending HSE waiting list for someone to eventually get back to me. It's an isolating experience. And I think, the time where we dealt with that on our own, it's gone, particularly during this pandemic when the Taoiseach was talking about things like having more mindfulness and going for walks as a way to alleviate stress. What we really need is a fully funded healthcare system with full mental health support. That support can only be gotten by a unified group of activists. So I'm happy Paul is joining. I'm happy that we're working together now. It can be extremely isolating when it comes to mental health to have it framed as a personal struggle. Whereas, if you're not feeling yourself, it's because you haven't played enough sport or you're not doing enough meditation or mindfulness. Now, a lot of people's anxiety, I think, comes down to their material conditions, people lacking housing, struggling to afford bills. So a serious plan to tackle that sort of problem, like mental health in this country, it needs to be calling for reform and support, but also challenging the inequalities and the austerity that we have here. I think People Before Profit has played a key part in that, the same with RISE, in calling for socialised affordable housing to get people off the streets, for public childcare to take the pressure off single parents, for fully funded healthcare system so people aren't waiting months for treatment. So I think that's something, we need to be unified in the fight for, and a mass movement of working class people is how you bring about change in those areas. Another important thing I think, that comes from having a unified left is the ability to give voices to groups who normally don't, or I guess regularly feel unheard. I was recently talking to friends and family who had been involved in the campaign for George and Kensho, which is, a tragic case of the failure of the state to provide funding for mental health services. But one thing that they brought up was, Paul Murphy bringing up the issue in the Dáil. The Nigerian community in Ireland is, it has very little representation in any part of the government that's on the council level or in the Shannon or in the Dáil. So the Nigerian community in Ireland are kind of left out by the political establishment, who are only really looking for votes from a certain demographic. But people I've spoken to have been extremely happy with the solidarity that People Before Profit and RISE have shown by taking up that fight in the Dáil and beyond, and helping, to bring that fight for justice and for a public investigation into mainstream politics. I think that type of politics, that's the type of thing we're trying to build. I think issues that affect the Black community, that don't, like racism or discrimination, it's not something that affects everyone, but it's something that People Before Profit has taken up as a struggle, as their own struggle, even though it's, for people from different backgrounds. That's the type of solidarity I think the party needs to be built on. I'm not a Debenhams worker, neither is Paul or Gino or Madeline, but we've all been down to support the pickets whenever we can, because issues like racism or Debenhams trying to cheat their workers, these are issues I think that we need to be united in opposing. And, we're going into a recession now. Debenhams won't be the last place that's on strike for unpaid redundancy. We may see protests on the same level as the water charges. And in the case that the government tries to pass another austerity budget, I think we've seen firsthand how the political establishment can twist the narrative. If you were listening to only Fine Gael during the water charges campaigns, you would have thought that that all the protesters were criminals or violent. But having Paul in the Dáil, having Gino in the Dáil, having them on the news to dispute the narrative is key to having these movements grow and become successful. In the same way with the Debenhams workers, I guess Micheál Martin was saying that there weren't any options, that there was nothing they could do. But when, I guess, People Before Profit put forward that bill with an alternative, we're breaking through that narrative, and we're showing people that, I guess, the civil war parties, they aren't really interested in helping regular workers. They're looking to help out big business and high finance. So I think, all in all, I think I'm optimistic moving forward. We've had a lot of new members recently, Paul included. So I'm optimistic about the political project we're trying to build. I'm optimistic about these fights for fair redundancy, for equal access to education, for mental health supports. I think these are things that we can successfully fight for when we're unified. So I'm extremely happy with Paul and RISE joining. I think it will be great moving forward.
Thank you so much, Dara, and it's great to hear that optimism as well for the coming struggles ahead. So there have been some questions coming in on the chat, so I'm going to go to some of them. And there's a lot of support, by the way, for Carol and for the Debenhams workers in the comments here. And there's a question for Carol, actually, so I might take that first. So there's a question here. Can Carol say what change she thinks that we need in our trade unions?
With regard to the trade unions, I think this particular strike now has been a huge struggle, because all the shop stewards are actually feeling that they're not getting the full support, because up to recently, we've been calling for Patricia King, who's ICTU, to join in with us, meet us, and protest and put out statements and things like that, and that hasn't been happening. So that's been a huge frustration. So we are calling at the moment that mandate need to up the game. I mean, as I said through the whole of my little speech there, only for all the left-wing parties, we wouldn't be still struggling, we wouldn't be still fighting in this campaign. So, but we are calling very seriously now on ICTU to up the game. And as I say, we can't go out and protest them, but we did want a half-day strike for all the companies to join with us and all the workers to get out there and get the law changed. And it has to be. So it is a battle, but we're constantly chipping away too at mandate, and we're strong women, and we will get there. We will get the law changed. That's for sure. Thank you, Madeleine.
Thanks very much, Carol. Thanks for that, and obviously whatever we can do to put pressure as well, we will continue to do that. There's been a few comments in the comment box there about government formation, left government. So there's a question about, will PBP vote for a left government or for a government led by Sinn Féin rather? There's also a question around whether we would rule out being a junior partner in a left-wing coalition, or indeed a Sinn Féin-led coalition with Fianna Fáil. And then the person is also asking, is it too far ahead to make such decisions? So I was wondering, maybe Gino could fill us in on that, maybe.
Yeah, well, it is. I mean, we just got over one election, so who knows when the next election could be? I think, I think this could go the full distance for 4 years. And what the kind of composition of the next Dáil is, it's difficult to know. There's every chance that the next, there could be a government without Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil. That's a possibility. It's also a possibility that Sinn Féin could go in with Fianna Fáil, which would be calamitous. Now, it begs the question: is there kind of enough votes for a left government? Just go back to last year. There was obviously a vote in the Dáil in relation to a government formation. And as a block, the 5 People for Profit Solidarity TDs voted for Mary Lou MacDonald to be Taoiseach. And obviously that didn't kind of manifest into, her being Taoiseach and so forth, but it was the right thing to do. But we do it with a kind of, we don't do it freely, and we have been critical of Sinn Féin in particular on a number of issues. So can there be a left government? It is a possibility at the next government if Sinn Féin led it. Now, would People for Profit be a junior partner? I don't see that happening at all. I don't see that situation happen. Could we support it externally? It's a possibility. That would have to be put to our members. That would have to be negotiated because it's down to policy. Because it can't be just left government in kind of words. It has to be policy in relation to kind of tackling the kind of the substantial issues that working class people find themselves in. But that's a debate that probably will kind of manifest itself over the next period because I presume Sinn Féin will say that they want to have a government. But they haven't ruled out Fianna Fáil or Fine Gael, so that kind of worries me to a major extent. But it's good that we're talking about. I think it's good that there's a discussion in society about having a government that's other than Fine Gael or Fianna Fáil. But we would not join a formation just for the sake of it, because Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil are not in it. That would be calamitous, because you look throughout the last 10 years. Where kind of radical organizations, similar kind of People for Profit, have gone into kind of government and have been obliterated. So you cannot, that can't happen under any circumstances. But it's good we're having the discussion, and but that will be kind of teased out over the next couple of years. And like what we want is obviously a radical transformation of society. And like my 5 years in the Dáil, and Paul will probably speak, there's limits what you can do in the Dáil, limits, and what's more important is the kind of that struggle that kind of is the cutting edge, and because the Dáil it's a bureaucratic kind of monolith, right? And yeah, it's good that we're there, right? But more importantly, is outside them gates, and it's good to have kind of a foot in kind of inside in. But more importantly, it's where people begin to kind of where they see change. It's not the Dáil. Where there's radical change that can happen is outside the Dáil, and that's why it's so important that that the party that we're in sees the major change happening socially and economically is outside the Dáil, with representatives exposing the system, the bourgeois system of Parliament, and who really run society. Because TDs don't really run society. I can tell you that they don't. The real people that run society are the vested interests that they represent. Fine Gael, Fianna Fáil.
Thanks, Gino. That's great. I know that Paul already kind of spoke a little bit about left government, so I mean, he might want to say something again, but there's a question here or a comment around about around Bord-na-Mona and the jobs, hundreds of people losing their jobs in Bord-na-Mona, and then Ireland is then buying in fossil fuel, and obviously there's been a lot of talk about the Shannon LNG, and all that. So I thought, obviously, Paul, you were talking about eco-socialism, so maybe you could make a comment about that, and as socialists, how should we deal with the issues of workers, for example, who face job losses because of trying to fight climate change?
Thanks, Madeline. Yeah, definitely. I mean, the way the Bord-na-Mona workers have been treated is really scandalous. It's interesting because the government has occasionally adopted the phraseology of like just transition, but they haven't given the workers anything like a just transition. At the same time that the government certainly tried to push ahead with LNG infrastructure, liquefied natural gas, which a lot of it would end up being fracked gas. They're kind of pushed back on that, but they're still investing in other fossil fuel infrastructure, and the workers have been treated very, very poorly. So I think this does get to the heart of like what a real just transition would look like, and what an eco-socialist Green New Deal would do. And I think there's a bottom line point is that we're for radical action to stop catastrophic climate change, and at the center of that is moving away from the use of fossil fuels extremely rapidly. And that does mean disrupting the nature of the way our economy is organized. But we don't think that has to come at any expense of ordinary workers. So the bottom line point is no worker, no small or medium farmer should lose income or jobs as a consequence of doing what we need to do in terms of climate change. And unfortunately, on the basis of the way the system is currently organized, that is, they're likely to try to put the burden for climate change on those who have no responsibility for it whatsoever. The Bord-na-Mona workers didn't make any of, the poor decisions which had led up to this point. They didn't have any power to do that. It's not their responsibility at all. And so instead, I think what we should advance very strongly is the call for, a massive green jobs program. And that's a whole variety of different things which could create tens, if not hundreds of thousands of jobs, and ensure that anybody who's currently working in the fossil fuel kind of infrastructure is able to transition to a meaningful job where they feel that they're able to use their skills and talents, and with a quality employment, unionized, etc. So some examples of the kind of work that we rapidly need to do and that would employ people, and we need to insulate people's homes. The government earlier this year pledged an amount of money to have a program of retrofitting of council houses across the state, and it's less than a third of what they give to the horse racing industry and the greyhound industry on a year-to-year basis. And that it doesn't make any sense. And this is something that can employ people, can reduce carbon emissions relatively significantly, and can save ordinary people, council tenants, money because they won't be spending as much money on heating. So you see how it's a very positive program for ordinary people, but the government is completely slow, extremely slow about it. A second thing would be investment in, for example, re-wetting the bogs, which is potentially a job that would be very appropriate for Bord-na-Mona workers. And there's biodiversity benefits there, but there's also benefits in terms of carbon storage. Another would be a massive program of afforestation. So Ireland has, and people might kind of notice this if you go to other countries, Ireland has very low levels of afforestation, very low levels of forest cover. We need to massively expand that as part of drawing down carbon from the atmosphere. Other things, obviously, investment in green energy. Ireland could and should be a leader in terms of wind and wave energy, but we're not currently, mostly because the private sector wasn't willing to make the levels of investment that would be required. So leading in that field. But I'd also say, and just finish on this, that when we think about green jobs, we should also think about what are known as care jobs. These are jobs, healthcare jobs, educational jobs, childcare jobs, jobs that are overwhelmingly currently dominated by women, currently jobs that are very undervalued, in terms of like how the establishment sees them, and undervalued literally in terms of the amount of pay that people get. But these are jobs that like add huge value to people's lives, being able to have, if you had a national childcare service publicly provided by the state, which is free for everybody, that massively improves people's lives. They're very useful jobs. They might not create profit, but they provide a very useful purpose, role for contribution to society. And like the healthcare jobs, like the education jobs, they're extremely, extremely low carbon. So shifting as a society to have more emphasis on care jobs as part of investment in green jobs is also an important part of how you would have like a genuine just transition. That's it.
Thanks, Paul. That's great. That was a great answer to that question. So, I suppose we're starting to finish up, but I have a couple of questions left, and I think I just want to take them. So I suppose I'll go to Dara, perhaps with this one, as someone who's a young person who would have been involved, particularly as an activist on protests and stuff like that. And there's a question here about how can we engage, or how do we, or should we, I suppose, engage in people power during a pandemic. So how should we be doing things? What can we do? What can't we do, etc. So maybe you could say a few words about that.
Yeah, I think it's a pretty difficult situation. We're all staying at home. We're abiding by these lockdowns because we want to protect loved ones. We want to protect essential workers and stuff. But I don't think the activism stops just because we're stuck at home. I think People Before Profits, one thing that we actually did pretty well, I think, was around the student nurses who were trying to organize that. They had a meeting with hundreds of student nurses on over Zoom. So I don't think, even if you can't meet in person, we can still do things online. And one benefit of that is that when you are trying to organize workers in person, when there's no lockdowns, it's quite difficult to get people from, I guess, loads of different areas all into one room. But when you do it over Zoom, you can get student nurses from all across the country, from different colleges. So I think there are some benefits to doing things online. The other thing is, I guess, that when protests are necessary, and the Debenhams workers have done this immensely well, I think they, credit is due there, that they've organized these strikes throughout the pandemic. They've been very, very good. There's hand sanitizer there. Everybody's wearing masks. Everyone is socially distanced. So I don't think it's impossible to protest during a pandemic, but when you do it right. I think the problem, I guess, we had a couple of weeks ago with the far right protests are these people who were protesting against the lockdowns. None of them were wearing masks. None of them were socially distanced. They were all in massive crowds, and the type of people who were going to go to an anti-lockdown protest, they weren't going to abide by the rules, so they could potentially spread the virus to other people. So I think when we are mobilizing during pandemics, and in cases like this, this might not be the last pandemic we ever have. Hopefully it is, but that we need to constantly be concerned with, keeping our essential workers safe. Everybody stays socially distanced. People bring their own hand sanitizer, wear your masks. So I think it's important not to give up the streets, not to let the pressure down on the government, because they have been failing a lot during this pandemic. They've failed public workers. They've failed frontline workers. They've failed people like the Debenhams workers who have lost their jobs. They've failed people like the nurses. I mean, it was only maybe a year ago, a couple months before this pandemic started, Simon Harris was threatening the nurses with financial repercussions because they wanted extra pay. So I think, just because there's a pandemic, we can't let up the pressure that we're putting on the government. We need to continue to protest, but we need to be smart about how we do it.
Thanks, Dara. Thanks, Dara. That's great. And I think that's a very positive note, I think, to end on tonight, actually. And obviously, as we're hopefully moving out of this pandemic and with vaccination rollouts hopefully speeding up, because it's been slow. We're hoping to obviously be able to do a lot more protesting and being on the streets a lot more than what we've been able to do over the last year. But as Dara said, the Debenhams workers, for example, have shown that there are ways to do this in a very safe manner. So Lastly, I'd like to reiterate what some of our speakers have said tonight in terms of getting involved. This is the right time to get involved with left-wing politics in Ireland. This is the time to really get stuck in and really begin to build an organisation that's going to be promoting socialism, change, a real change in this country, and standing up for workers, standing up for all the oppressed people in this country that are fighting back and fighting for a better society. So thank you to Gino, to Paul, to Dara, and a very special thank you to Carol for joining us this evening. You're a big inspiration to us all. And so everyone, anyone who's not joined People Before Profit yet, this is the last call out. Make sure you join, click on the link below, and get involved with People Before Profit.